Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Beyond Earth Institute. We have a very full program today featuring Tory Bruno, CEO of the United Launch Alliance, and we're looking forward to getting right into it. But first, for those of you not familiar with Beyond Earth Institute, or Beyond Earth as we call it, we are a think tank that is founded with an ambitious mission to create a policy and legal framework that will enable the creation of new homes for humanity in space. We believe that the day when we will have the technological and the financial means to create new branches of human civilization in space is nearly at hand. And our national and international policies must anticipate rather than lag behind the capabilities of these capabilities so that we can reach our goal in the soonest time frame possible. That's what Beyond Earth is attempting to do. And I invite you to consider the mission of the Beyond Earth as you watch today's program. And if it resonates with you, I invite you to reach out to us, get involved, and be part of the Beyond Earth movement. Okay, now I want to note a note about the technological aspects of the call today. All of you are watching on a social media platform, which is kind of cool for us. If you are interested for posting questions, we want you to go to Twitter and use the hashtag #BeBeyond, BE Beyond, and you'll see this probably at the bottom of your screen periodically throughout the program. So what about today's program? The theme for today is defining what is meant by communities in space. Words matter. We hear this a lot. The words that space advocates have used over the years, like space settlement, space colonization, manifest destiny, these terms evoke a history of oppression which contrasts diametrically with our vision of the future that's full of abundance for all as we access the limitless resources of the solar system. So at Beyond Earth, we suggest the term simply communities beyond Earth. This articulates our vision, and we'll seek to avoid using more divisive terminology. And we've released a paper on this. As a matter of fact, if you go to beyondearth.org, you could download our latest paper. In our first segment, I'll turn this over to Tom Murata, who's the primary author of that paper, who will explain it in full detail and what it contains. So Tom is an advisor for industry affairs and outreach at the Office of Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. He's also a co-founder of Beyond Earth. Hi, Tom. How you doing? So Tom, I'm going to let you take it from here. And I'm looking forward to a great talk. And we'll see you on the other side.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thank you for the great credit. I also have to give credit to this paper to Tony DeTora and Heloise Verdatier, who also helped. But thank you all for attending our second webinar. I'm very excited to be here. As Steve mentioned, the Beyond Earth Institute, or BE, as we like to call it, is dedicated to crafting policies to support the development of communities beyond Earth. Eventually, we expect to see human civilization moving out to the planets and to the stars. When will that be? And can we make it happen more quickly by making changes to our legal and policy approaches? This is what we explore at the Beyond Earth Institute. Besides hosting exciting conversations with interesting people like ULA's CEO Tory Bruno, who we will hear from shortly, BE also drafts policy papers and recommendations on how to achieve our goal of sustained and thriving human communities beyond Earth. But what exactly does that phrase mean, communities beyond Earth? Well, that is the subject of our most recent policy paper, which is available on our website right now at beyondearth.org under the Policy Resources tab. I'm going to take a few minutes to walk us through the basics of the paper. So based on recent experience and conversations we've had with other space policy experts, Beyond Earth has identified several philosophical and rhetorical debates which might pose significant barriers to our policy work and achieving our vision. One such debate is the definition of a group of people living permanently off the planet and the terminology to use for such a group. Like Steve said, at various times and in various publications, terms like settlement, colony, city, and outpost have all been used. Attempts to reach consensus on a fixed term or even agree what any individual term means have been fraught with historical and political concerns. Some of this divergent attitude about what constitutes a community in space is clearly expressed in our last policy paper, which was released in June and is also available on our website. Again, as Steve said, words matter, definitions matter, and clarity matters. Beyond Earth has chosen to use the phrase communities beyond Earth in our mission statement, in our reports, and in our policy work. For the sake of clarity in our policy research, analysis, and recommendations, it is critical that BE be unambiguous in our definition of a community beyond Earth. Hence, in order to establish a common foundation for future publications, Beyond Earth proposes the following definition. Here it comes. A community beyond Earth is defined as a group of people building, sustaining, and growing an economically vibrant, self-governing society outside of the atmosphere of our home planet. This definition represents the starting point of Beyond Earth's work, leading to answering an important question. When will the first community beyond Earth be built? And stay tuned for that. We're going to have a lot more information on answering that question in the coming weeks and months. But in the process of writing this paper, BE examined a number of previous definitions, including US legislation dating back to the 1980s, statements by entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, definitions proposed by international organizations like the European Space Agency and the Moon Village Association. But now we're going to dive a little deeper into the definition and examine each component in turn. The first phrase, a group of people building, sustaining, and growing, implies that people are the most important part of any community, and that goes for communities beyond Earth as well. A community is defined by the people within it. The people who live within the structures and borders of a physical location will have all manner of interactions and relationships. They will try to attract more people to join their community. And building, sustaining, and growing requires a commitment to the community, an intent to create a lasting, permanent association. There are a number of signs that people are committed to a community. The creation of families, or families entering and joining the community, individual ownership of residences designed to last for decades, and individual ownership or control of land and resources. Obviously, any community will require physical habitats to house the people within it, and mechanical infrastructure needed to sustain a growing society over time. The technical ability to expand the physical space as needed and desired will require special considerations in space in communities beyond Earth. The physical and technical needs are also significant considerations for the ability to grow into a full-fledged society in space over time. Now we move on to the second clause, economically vibrant. Economically vibrant refers to a community's ability to support itself and grow. Specifically, an economically vibrant community is one in which a diversity of products and services are created, bought, and sold. Furthermore, it is expected that these communities will trade with other communities, both on Earth and elsewhere in the solar system eventually. This requires reliable transportation networks, something that ULA will certainly help with. History has shown that the most enduring and the most successful communities had access to and from other communities in order to allow for the regular exchange of goods, information, and people. While lower prices can help stimulate transportation activity, Reliability of transportation will be the most important dimension to build that full-fledged society in space. The people in those communities have to know another ship will eventually come, for sure. So let me put this economically vibrant idea in the proper context. For instance, if the only work being done at a facility in space is government-funded research and development, it would not meet our definition of being a community beyond Earth. This also applies for most manufacturing or mineral extraction. If, for example, all a moon base does is extract lunar ice and export it, it would most likely not meet the definition of a space community. However, it is expected that over time, these types of single-purpose facilities may eventually evolve into a full-fledged community. The third clause, a self-governing society, is the most critical and one of the most challenging to define. A true community beyond Earth will have an internal governance structure and a system of enforceable laws by which the people agree to abide. A space community should have a fair and just governance structure that respects the rule of law and allows redress of grievances. What's more, this system must respect the due process rights of individuals and provide clear, transparent, and accessible processes to amend the rules governing the residents. We believe it is critical to distinguish between a mere permanent human presence in space, which should be encouraged and celebrated, from a genuine community beyond Earth. The final aim of a community beyond Earth is to create a permanent society in space. A necessary step on that path is first establishing self-governance in space. While this definition is the work of significant analysis and consideration, it's possible that we, the BE staff, may have missed something. We're not perfect. We may have overlooked some critical elements. This definition will possibly change in the future as new information comes to light, and as we gather feedback from additional stakeholders and participants in our group. We welcome a discussion of potential improvements to the definition. We are actively seeking additional information. So if you have any comments or concerns, please be sure to email us using the contact form on the website. Or as Steve mentioned, you can tweet at us using the hashtag #BeBeyond or using our hashtag or our Twitter name #BeBeyond20. So thank you all for your attention. Steve, that's a great overview of the paper, and I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay.
Tony. Hi, Tony.
Thank you, Tom. So we're going to introduce our keynote speaker, Tory Bruno, now, CEO of United Launch Alliance. So ULA created much excitement in the space community several years ago with its CISLUNAR 1000 plan, where they laid out a strategy for lunar economic development that would support a population of 1,000 people in space by 2050. Today, Tory will present an extension of the CISLUNAR 1000 plan with a new proposal for the creation of Strategic Propellant Reserve. Again, please post your questions on Twitter with hashtag #BeBeyond. And thanks again, Tory, for joining us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Tony. I am thrilled to be here with all of you today. I share Beyond Earth's vision of thousands of people living and working in space, ordinary people like you and I who have gone to space because their jobs are in space, because they can have a better life in space. And I would like to talk today about how we stimulate that future coming to pass within our lifetimes. And as you have said, this is really about having a self-sustaining cislunar economy. So if we could have the slides, please, I'll walk through those, and then time permitting, we'll do Q&A. Go to the next slide, please. So as it turns out, there is tremendous natural resources on the moon and in the space that we refer to as cislunar space. So between Earth and the moon and beyond to the near Earth objects or asteroids that are within easy reach of the moon. Just tremendous wealth and abundance that literally defies human imagination. On these bodies, we now understand that there is more than 1,000 years of this planet's annual production of industrial metals and more precious metals, gold, silver, platinum, than have been extracted from the earth in 40,000 years of human history. So there is a tremendous potential for economic wealth and economic activity just in the natural resources, let alone specialty manufacturing and things that we can only make practically in the environment of space. Why have we not tapped this now that we know it's there? Well, like any economic activity that occurs across great distances, it's all about transportation. And transportation is all about the availability of energy or propellant or fuel, as we say. And so just as nearly all economic activity on Earth is really foundationally supported by fossil fuel, the equivalent would need to be present in space, especially in space, because today, when we go there, we bring all of our propellant out of the very, very deep gravity well of Earth. And that makes transportation through space very, very expensive. However, it turns out that the universe has provided. If we go to the next slide, please. The great discovery of our time that has gone largely unheralded is the fact that water is nearly everywhere. And when we look to the moon, we now understand that there is over 20 billion metric tons of ice at the moon in permanently shadowed craters, especially at the poles. This is literally millions of years of propellant, because it turns out that water is relatively easily converted into liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the most energetic, practical chemical propellants that we use today. So this is simply there, already in space, already outside Earth's gravity well, and able to be present and support the transportation network that would allow this vast economic activity, that would support the presence, permanent presence, economic activity-based presence of people who live and work in space. All we need is the infrastructure in place to mine the ice, to convert it to propellant, and to distribute it to a transportation network that would exist in CISLUNAR space. And that's what we want to talk about today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is an idea that we have brought in front of the National Space Council via its Users Advisory Group when asked what would be the one thing that the government could do, the one big lever that it could pull to stimulate economic activity in CISLUNAR space. And the answer to that, we believe, is the establishment of a strategic propellant reserve. Go to the next slide, please. So what we're talking about is this recognition that propellant is the great enabler. In situ propellant, propellant that is already in space and does not have to be lifted from Earth, is the key to all of this. And that if we could have a reason for the US government to establish a set of infrastructure to obtain and refine that propellant, in our case, to mine water and break it down into liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, that would establish the infrastructure that could also fuel this economy. And the model for that we brought forward is the idea of establishing a strategic propellant reserve, something that would create excess capability to stimulate this economy, to fuel this in-space economy, but also to have the very practical applications of protecting that economy from interruptions in supply, and of course, to also support international peacekeeping and regulatory environments that would also need to exist to make all of this practical. Now, there's a precedent for this. If we go to the next slide, there is a thing here today called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was established after the oil crisis of the 1970s. Today, it contains nearly 750 million barrels of crude oil. It was established by act of Congress. It's administered by the International Energy Agency, and here in the United States, in Texas, underground. It protects the U.S. economy from 90 days of import interruption. And it today is actually holding more like 143 days of import protection. It's administered by the DOE, Department of Energy, and to establish this, it required about $26 billion. That's an important number, so I want you to take note of that because we're going to come back to this when we discuss the economics of establishing this in space. And it breaks down, as you can see, and interestingly enough, today in the US, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is actually self-sustaining in terms of its cost. It buys and sells, trades, if you will, crude oil on the commercial marketplace and supports its own infrastructure costs and administration costs. So that is sort of the reference that we model our in-space strategic reserve on. So one might ask, where would this reserve reside? Well, it could all reside on the moon where it's extracted, or it could reside at natural transportation nodes like we show here, surface of the moon, the Lagrange point 1, and of course, Earth orbit, where lots of economic activity occurs today. If we go to the next slide, we've done a little bit of modeling. And this is off to be studied by various folks who will do much more sophisticated modeling and lots of study. But at ULA, we have a team of engineers, scientists, and economists that have taken a whack at this ahead of time. And we started not with an assumption of 90 days like we have in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but instead 2 years. And where that came from is the notion that there would be regular missions going not just through cislunar space, but leaving cislunar space to and from Mars. And so we did not want to have a risk of an interruption of transportation to and from Mars. And so that 2 years comes from that, as well as a year of commercial demand within cislunar space. And when we do that, and we make the assumptions that it will exist in these locations and do economic modeling, this would be the size of a potential strategic propellant reserve in cislunar space distributed throughout. So actually what is a relatively modest 6.7, 6.8 metric tons of total reserves that is maintained as a minimum, while excess capacity is also sold as its own economic activity to stimulate mining in space, manufacturing in space, and so on. So that's about the size of what we talk about when we discuss this idea of a strategic propellant reserve. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so we actually built an economic model that captured all of this activity, mining and transportation and manufacturing, even tourism, and we've plotted the economic growth of this versus time as this strategic reserve comes into place and as it grows and generates excess capacity that could fuel that other economic activity. The top of that line is what we estimate as the total economic potential by 2050, and it is literally $3 trillion per year. That black wedge at the bottom is the portion of that that is the propellant itself as a business. So the sort of analog of gasoline or diesel fuel here on Earth and its own transportation economic activity. But the total, the leverage that 630 billion has could be as high as $3 trillion across all of that activity. All of that with the US government investment of potentially only around $20 billion in a sort of government-owned, contractor-operated activity to mine the ice on the moon, distribute that ice at these locations, and then continually refresh that with water that has been converted into rocket fuel to make this transportation happen. So literally the same scale of size of the relatively modest petroleum reserve here on Earth placed in space, and yet this tremendous economic lever. So if we go to the next slide, please. I thought it might be helpful to imagine this journey, or to see this journey laid out in time. And so we would start today on this chart on the top left there, where we have 6 people typically permanently residing in space. All of that together with all of the satellites and other economic activities, about $400 billion a year. Of course, those 6 people are really doing research and exploration-based mission. There's very little economic activity involving humans in space. But as we begin to move towards the Artemis program, where in 2024, we have permanent orbiting stations around the moon. We are exploring and setting up the infrastructure that could establish this ice mining in this reserve. Now, perhaps there are as many as just over a dozen people. And the economic activity has grown by 50%. We're upwards of $600 billion per year. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, now we are actually beginning the production of lunar propellant. Now we're just under $1 trillion a year of economic activity. There's 100 people living and working there in that region. Another 5 years, it's over $1 trillion. There's 300 people. We're beginning to see other economic activity like space tourism and manufacturing in space really expanding in a significant way. Another 5 years, it's over $1.5 trillion, and so on, until we see it by 2050 in our economic modeling, over 1,000 people permanently living and working in space in generating this $3 trillion a year economy. So a pretty exciting future, and something that could happen within our lifetimes. Go to the next slide, please. All right, I'm not going to torture you with this very complicated chart, but I just wanted to give you a feel for some of the other issues that surround this, that go beyond technology and beyond just the pure economic theory, but rather some of the practicalities of what we will need. So if you look down that left side, we're talking about policy and legal framework issues that would need to be in place for any economic activity, and certainly including this one. Property rights, who owns space, who can use space, excise rights, which is a fancy way of saying who controls or owns resources that are extracted from space, the access to it, non-interference between private entities that are trying to do business in space, and how would appropriate regulation work. And then along the top, we are looking at some of the more important elements that are already in place, such as the Outer Space Treaty, the U.S. Commercial Space Competitiveness Act. It's relatively recent, and Luxembourg has stood up as sort of an economic and banking center in the world to put in place laws that could be international laws that could govern some of this. And so, for example, on property rights, these treaties and frameworks generally say you can't go to space as a country and claim pieces of it. You can't plant a flag and say, the moon is now, New California and it belongs to the United States. You can't do that. But what you do need to have in place, which you see way over on the right, are a clear set of rights for people to go there and conduct operations, whether or not you can annex territory. If we want to have economic activity in space that sustains all of these people living off-world permanently, then you have to be able to have the right to be there and to at least operate. And of course, what you take in terms of excise, these natural resources, there's no real comment on that, clear comment on the Outer Space Treaty. The Commercial Space Act says, you should be able to do that. You should be able to extract resources, own them, and sell them, as does Luxembourg law. And what we would need would be a broad general acceptance amongst all of the participants, because this will inherently be an international activity, that is something that you can do. You can go to space as a company, you can mine platinum, and then that platinum can be yours to take home and actually sell. If you can't sell it, if you can't own it, there's no economic activity. And of course, economic access. We need to have an environment where royalties and taxes by various international bodies are not so burdensome that they are interfering with the growth of that economic activity. Non-interference, you can't have someone build a mine, have someone else do something that interferes with those operations right on top of them, for example. So we need to have some rules of the road, some regulation, if you will, which is really what we talk about in the bottom area, a means of having generally accepted and agreed upon rules of the road and a means to enforce that against bad actors who do not recognize or at least do not agree with those. So this is some of the broader framework and some of the kinds of things that Beyond Earth thinks about in that think tank and will make recommendations to policymakers. But in our economic model, we want to identify those as pretty important. And then last slide, it is impossible for me ever to get up without showing this slide, 140 successful missions in a row, 100% mission success. But now when we talk about this bright future of permanent human habitation beyond our planet, this is just the beginning. And so that is the vision. And if we have time, I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Tory. That's very inspiring. Really appreciate you joining us today. So to engage with Tory and field audience questions, we're going to bring on Michelle Hanlon as well, who is co-director of the Air and Space Law Program at the University of Mississippi School of Law and president of For All Moonkind, an organization created to manage the preservation of history and human heritage in outer space. I'm Tony DiTora, and I'll be moderating this discussion. So again, welcome, Tory, Michelle. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
All right. Tory, from your presentation, you had that grid. Brett, can I get that slide about the legal framework? I know there's no cool rocket or space pictures on there, but as Michelle said, the law is always cool. So, but this really starts to speak to some of the questions down the path that Beyond Earth wants to take. So you have the required legal framework, and then you have 5 different categories: property rights, excise rights, economic access, non-interference, and appropriate regulation. So Michelle, if you look at these 5 categories and look at more in terms of longer term needs for any economic activity, do you think that this really lays the groundwork for everything, or is it the list comprehensive? What else should we be looking at in here, and which is the most important?
So first of all, I think it's spectacular. And for a non-lawyer, it's a lot better than I could do to put together an economic plan for space. So hats off to you. I think this lays out the groundwork perfectly about the foundational. I think what was really important about what Tory said was that we need to have something in place so that investors know that when they mine something, they can get the investment out of it. If we don't have that assurance, there's no incentive to go there. So the only thing I would point out is with respect, I think the most important part is this non-interference. And as the chart points out, the Outer Space Treaty says space is free for exploration and use by all states and all their nationals, right? But it also says in Article 9 that we have to have due regard for the activities of each other in space. And Article 9 also says that if there is any harmful interference, then we have to consult with each other about that harmful interference. So the Outer Space Treaty already builds in this concept of, I'm not going to call it property, but this concept of, okay, if you are there doing something, everyone else has a responsibility to let you do what you want to do with it. So I think this is a really important dynamic within the Outer Space Treaty that we're working through right now. And as we talk about calling it anything we accept property, safety zones, whatever, we and a lot of people sort of, we're in the space law community, we're sort of, what does the Outer Space Treaty say? I completely agree. The Outer Space Treaty absolutely does not say you cannot mine property. It says you can, if you mine it, you own it, essentially. And we've shown that customary law would back that, because both the US and the USSR Russia have taken stuff from the moon and brought it back and called it their own. So yeah, I think the most important thing I would make is that this concept of non-interference, from which we will build into a concept of property rights is already in the framework.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. So is there any area you would come at differently than Tory has laid out here for us?
I think the only area that I paused or stumbled over was in the appropriate regulation. We can't have mining regulations without thinking about other aspects. And of course, I'm going to talk about heritage protection because of For All Mankind. I'm going to talk about scientific exploration. Should we keep the far side available just for astronomers? These are all different interests. And I believe that, we need the mining in order to get the economy going. But it'd be nice to think about managing other things and what we want to protect. Where we shouldn't mine, perhaps. We don't want to mine under the eagle, right? Those are the kinds of things I would add to this chart.
Okay. And Tory, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. That is a great input and something that we're going to capture when we communicate this, because you're absolutely right. CISLUNAR space is just the beginning of human exploration and expansion beyond this planet. And even within that space, as you say, there are heritage sites and legitimate needs for exploration that have to be protected. It would be a crime to all humanity to make it impossible to do astronomy from the moon, for example, or certainly to dig a mine underneath the eagle and lose that forever. Absolutely not.
All right. So, Tory, in 30 years, by 2050, you show more than 1,000 people living and working in space. Now, we've sort of moved from a mountaineering model where you bring everything you need, you get there as quickly as you can, you do what you want to do, and you leave, to more of an ISS. We've got more of what I call an oil rig model, where you have a more permanent structure, and the crew goes there, they do their work until the next crew comes. So, when you envision these 1,000 people, is that an oil rig model? Is it more of a community, a longer term community concept, or how is that envisioned?
It is, but you want to think of this as a journey. So just as we start with, as you described it first, a mountaineering model, it will move through the oil rig model to finally, when we talk about 2050, there's still some, I'll call it oil rig elements to it. At this point, we are starting to see a lot of economic activity that begins and ends in space. We are manufacturing habitats from in situ materials. We are having economic activity between the people who live there. We mine propellant in space, we use it in space. We manufacture things in space that are used in space. Not everything is brought back to the Earth at this point because there's a permanent community living there and supporting itself.
Okay, gotcha. And then, Michelle, as we look to that future with hundreds or thousands of people in space, are there good foundational models in place? So, for example, the ISS IGA, the Intergovernmental Agreement, would that be a good, useful tool for that? Why or why not? And is there something better already in place?
So I believe the IGA, the Intergovernmental Agreement, is a really good tool. Not so much because of what it offers, but what it promises. So the IGA actually amends the Outer Space Treaty with respect to the people to the nations that are party to it. So under the Outer Space Treaty, we have a very sort of complex liability, not complex, the liability is very simple, but how you deal with liability involves commissions and so forth, diplomatic negotiations. The IGA says, we're just going to have cross waivers of liability. And so that actually changed the parties' relationships underneath the Outer Space Treaty. So to me, that's a great model because it says, look, we can abide by all of the guidelines and principles in the Outer Space Treaty, and we can make agreements multilaterally, bilaterally, to change those so that we can advance better and more simply and more easily. So I think the IGA is a great model in that sense. Tony, I don't think there's a model for what we're doing in space. There's nothing on Earth like space. People say Antarctica, people say the high seas, but that's different. The fact is space is endless. Even though we can't access all of it yet, we will be able to, and we've never had anything like that before. And it's also, enforcement's a huge issue. We can't enforce things on the high seas. How are we even going to imagine how to embrace enforcement in space? So there's no model. And I think, we have to recognize that, and we can't keep looking backwards. We have to look forwards and accept that.
those are great points. And I would add to that, I think a lot of people imagine that, we'll sit down this afternoon before we do any of this economic activity we just talked about, and we'll write up a bunch of regulations and we'll sign a treaty and the law will be there first. And that's probably not what is going to happen. And in reality, probably isn't what should happen, because as you point out, there are so many new issues about space and about all of this that have not been encountered before. We need a framework that gets us there and then allows us to develop the regulations and the legal framework that is appropriate based on what we discover about living and working in space. And I think it's very, very possible it starts with things like the Artemis Accords, for example, where the major players who go there first, in the United States will be one of those countries, get together and say, all right, these are what we've agreed upon as the rules of behavior, our norms, as we begin this journey. And if you want to join our club and participate with us, you'll agree, non-binding, but you'll agree to participate in these same norms of behavior. And if you don't, you can't be in our club. And then as time goes by, formal enforceable regulation will be put into place.
Interesting. So the Artemis Accords are one model of that. Is that a useful tool to think about as we move forward?
Oh, absolutely. I think the Artemis Accords I think the Artemis Accords are brilliant because they are transparency. They're showing what the United States expects, and they all are right in line with the Outer Space Treaty. There's nothing new here, right? We're just trying to take those baby steps towards figuring out this concept of safety zones and non-interference in property. And I agree with Tory completely. We can't do top-down regulation for space. It has to be bottom up. We have to get there and understand what we're dealing with. It's some stuff we've never seen before. How many humans have been on the moon? And sadly, we're losing our moonwalkers. So we have no frame of reference. We cannot start legislating without that frame of reference.
Okay. All right. So, Tory, you pointed out ULA has had 140 consecutive successful launches. That's incredible. The consistency, the reliability. When you get a contract for a Delta IV, for example, you put all of your knowledge, your experience, your blood, toil, tears, and sweat into that launch. It operates for a few minutes, right? And it does its job and it does it right. How do you move from that to in-space infrastructure, to systems that need to last decades? How do you have a shift within ULA to enable that?
Oh, that is a great question. And so when we talk about that, it's not the one-way journey anymore. It becomes a transportation network where the assets that we lift from Earth originally are reused in space. So, for example, today, there's so much excitement about reusability in the world of rocketry. The upper stages of a rocket are an asset that should go to space, stay in space, and be reused there, and be designed for that. Now, it turns out that the environment you have to survive to get from the surface of the Earth into space is so incredibly harsh and so incredibly hostile that those technologies, once in space, are really well suited for that. And what we then do are simply to add the ancillary systems like communications and navigation and power sources that the satellite industry knows how to do very well to allow those larger transportation elements to become sort of the trucks, the tugboats, the semi-trucks, the container ships of space. That actually is not going to be that difficult for us. As we talked about in the presentation, the really hard thing is the propellant. And thank heavens, the universe has provided. It's already there.
Okay. And then I'd like to now shift back to the Beyond Earth definition that we shared earlier, that Tom talked about. Brett, if you could put that up. So I'd like to get your thoughts on these elements here. So a community beyond Earth is defined as a group of people building, sustaining, and growing an economically vibrant, self-governing society outside the atmosphere of our home planet. And we also make a note later on in the document that we know there will be groups of people living in space that do not meet this definition, but we're attempting to delineate the off-world societies which are of the most interest to us, which will truly establish and grow permanent human presence off the home planet. So I'd like to ask both of you your thoughts on this. Michelle, if you'd start and give us your feedback on this definition.
So first, I'm so grateful that you sort of move us beyond settlement and colony and all those words that, and as Steve said when he started, words are so important. And I think, to me, I love this definition. I think it captures an awful lot. I think it's very aspirational because the sustaining part, I can't personally imagine at this point by 2050 having a community on Earth that doesn't need a community off Earth that doesn't need Earth to survive. I also question and I don't know how to put it into the definition, but when we talk about for all mankind and preservation, we talk about how important it is to bring history with us into communities. So communities are sustained by their history and by the social interaction between people. And so we want to make sure that when you have a community beyond Earth, it still has that cohesiveness that you see on Earth. And that, I think that grows with relationships. And so I would like to see a little bit more definitional sort of concept of that relationship between the people who are building this community together.
Okay, great. Tory?
Yes, well, I think this statement is just tremendously important. The front part of that I talked about in this vision we have for economic activity, but the part that I think is really, really important and not always thought about people is the last statement. As self-governing society outside the atmosphere of our home planet, it is not enough for our species simply to live. It is vitally important for life to be worth living, for people to have human dignity. And the single most powerful enabler of human dignity is freedom, and freedom cannot be had without self-governance. That's the foundation of our country and all democracy-loving countries around this planet. And when we take people beyond our planet, nothing changes. That is still an imperative. Initially, these are going to be folks who are living and working. Remember our metaphor around, summit climbing and oil wells, out in, oil platforms. But eventually we have a lot of people living out there. They may start out as citizens of their nations of origin who will require local governance ability, just like we have here, where we have cities and counties and states and so on. And eventually, in the much farther distant future than 2050, there's likely to be such a degree of autonomy in so many people that those might be their own nation states or whatever we use as the equivalent of that. But it's important to remember that human dignity is going to be foundational for all of this and cannot be overlooked.
Okay. So we've got some questions now from coming in on Twitter and on YouTube. So let me get to some of those. So Tory, are you considering other alternative propulsion methods like Hall thrusters or solar sails for CISLUNAR mining and operations?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about a complex distributed transportation network that's going to use more than one kind of technology relative to propulsion, just like we have here on Earth. I mean, we have cargo ships crossing the vast Pacific Ocean. We have trains meeting them and trucks and box fans and my personal car to the grocery store. All of those are different in scale and kind of analogous to the list of propulsion technologies that was embedded in that question. They'll all be present, as well as nuclear propulsion when we talk about our journeys beyond CISLUNAR space, where the vast, unimaginably large scale of distance creates transportation times, transit times, that begin to interfere with our human scale of our lifespans and what is practical for us to commit to for human missions. And therefore, we need things like nuclear propulsion that can really shorten down that span of transportation.
Okay. I've got a question here from Sandra Irwin at Space News. Does ULA plan to develop a super heavy Vulcan to support transportation needs of the future CISLUNAR economy?
So thank you for the question, Sandra. we'll develop whatever our customers need us to do. And right now we are finishing up the development of our brand new space launch vehicle, the Vulcan, which is a single core. I think Sandra is referring to the possibility of a 3-core Vulcan, for example. If that is something that the marketplace asks of us, we know how to do it. And we would be pleased to do that. I don't know the answer just yet.
Okay, very good. There's a question about what flight rate will be needed to make CISLUNAR possible, and should governments buy bulk rockets of many launch providers to meet needed demand?
Yes, it will ramp up. So, the flight rate that would even be associated with that middle of the span, say the 2040, 2045 or so, even before we get all the way up to 2050 and beyond, is probably 2 to 3 times higher than the highest flight rates we see here on Earth today. It does plateau because, again, this is really about transportation in space. Initially, we're bringing material and people from the Earth to establish that infrastructure, but once it's there, it becomes more and more in situ based. And yes, when you're going to have a lot of flights, a lot of anything, it is always economically advantageous to commit to a bulk so that you can attain economies of scale. And that would absolutely be a role the government could play.
Okay. Michelle, do you have anything to add on CISLUNAR flight rate or any of these questions?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I'd like to point out is a lot of people think that lawyers are here to put a stop to everything. And, at the University of Mississippi, we're really focused on doing everything we can to support companies like ULA and help get the policy and the legislation and the regulations we need that will actually bolster rather than suppress the space industry. And so, whatever we can do, we're talking to commercial space all the time about what we can get from the government, what kind of rules we need, what rules we can get loosened up, always keeping in mind, of course, that there are things we want to protect as well.
Okay. And then I got one more question from the audience here. What variations of ownership and operation are being explored regarding the Strategic Propellant Reserve? And let's go back to Tory for that one.
Yeah, sure. This is a brand new idea that we've just taken in front of the government via the Space Council through its users advisory group. And we recommended that this be studied. It's just an idea. We've done our own modeling and it looks pretty great to us. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of complexity to this. They have accepted the recommendation to study it, and that is starting now. And so that's really the status. Watch this space for a few months.
Okay. And Michelle, as we look forward, what sort of legal structures and ownership would be, advantageous in your opinion? A monopoly of a government-owned propellant reserve, other commercial depots? I don't know if some of the existing petroleum companies would like to get into the in-orbit fueling system.
Yeah, I would love to see something that's not government centric. I'd like to see the industry come together and build their own governance. I think that's really important when we talk about a human community in space. Is let's move away from these national sovereign structures and paradigms. And if we can get commercial space to work together to come up with some sort of strategic plan or agree to some sort of strategic distributions, I think that would be much more ideal as a basis for our human communities.
Okay, but for national security, you probably want as much control over it as possible, right?
Yeah.
All right, I've got one last question before we turn it back. When do you believe we will see the establishment of the first community beyond Earth? Michelle, will you take that first?
So by definition of a community that can sustain itself with dignity without need to come back to Earth, I think we're talking about 100 years. I think in terms of the vision that Tory Bruno shared with us, I think is very realistic. I look forward to seeing a community, maybe not a completely self-sustainable community off of Earth, beyond Earth in my lifetime.
Okay, and Tory?
I agree completely.
Okay. Well, that's very good. So thank you both for joining us. Let me bring Steve back in here. And there There he is.
Hey guys, what a fantastic presentation, conversation. Tory, really excited about how you're putting into your own framework of reaching that point in 2050. You're considering the policy considerations. That's really dovetails very closely what we're most concerned about. So you know, I'm very excited, and thank you, Michelle, for really having and providing some very enlightening feedback and insights into this what we're facing. So although I hope it's not going to be 100 years before we have a permanent colony, but it's everyone here is playing the long game, right? So we understand that it's it's going. We just need to continue to move, make these steps as they need to be made. The technology is advancing. Technology is advancing thanks to people like Tory advancing at a pace greater than it has been in past decades. So the excitement is really there. It's palpable, and I think everyone in the community who's interested in the future is really coming together and harder than ever to make this future a reality. So again, I want to thank you both for joining us, and I'll just take a couple of minutes. I'll let you go, and I'll just take a couple of minutes. I want to thank several other people. Probably most notably, I want to thank Brett Jones for his work. And Brett, if you want to come out and wave to the crowd, Brett has been.
Thank you, Steve.
He's the guy behind the scenes making it all possible for us and making all this go smoothly for us. I also want to thank Sean Hadley, who's another BE co-founder who's been integral involved in all aspects of making this possible and Beyond Earth possible. Also, David Bullock, who is a new member of the Beyond Earth team. Thank him for all the marketing and work that he's done to make this possible. And I also want to acknowledge our two interns that have joined us in the last few months, Sai Sankirth and Paras Adlaka. So thank you guys for being part of this. So, please follow us on social media. Download the report. We also have another report on our webpage, again, beyondearth.org. We do have a donation button on there. Our activities. Our activities are we're making this available, and we are looking for folks to participate, both as donors and as volunteers. If you're interested in this mission, please be in touch with us. We'd like to get you involved. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for a fantastic program, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.